But to really understand the significance of what Morrison and Quitely did and what that first page represents, we're gonna need some context. So here to provide that, returning to the show after 3 years is our special guest X-Men expert, Connor Goldsmith. Connor, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so can you explain what had been going on in the X-Men comics in the years leading up to Morrison coming in?
So basically, the 90s, which sort of retrospectively has been called the Iron Age of comics, was a pretty feast or famine time. If you go to sort of look at the X-Men holistically, and start, I guess, in the year that you and I were born, 1988, if you look at the X-Men in the late 80s, Chris Claremont had essentially built them into the most profitable and popular IP in comic books. By the end of the 1980s, publishers and retailers would measure the sales of any given issue by the X-Men Index, which was comparing the sales of that issue to that month's sales of Uncanny X-Men. So there was really no stopping it. And because it was so successful, under Claremont for 16 years, from 75 to 91, and, with the help of some other architects like Louise Simonson and Alan Davis and other people who, participated in that, I think that they basically decided it was too big to fail. So they kept introducing new titles. Eventually, they started realizing that crossover stories among all of the different X titles were enormously successful. It started with the Mutant Massacre in the mid-'80s, and then, they sort of did one every year after that. And all of this sort of led up to the Siege Perilous storyline that ended the Australian era and sort of revamped the X-Men into the form that is most familiar to 90s kids, because it's the team from the cartoon, which was Claremont and Jim Lee, the artist, sort of rebooted X-Men. It was a big initiative under editor-in-chief Bob Harris, to relaunch X-Men entirely by adding a new title. Uncanny continued, but there was also just X-Men and X-Men #1, which launched in 1991 and was sort of brought that new team together, and brought Cyclops and other characters who had been out of the main X-Men team back into the main team, is, I believe, still the best-selling comic book issue of all time. It was a momentous success. The thing that happened then, though, is that Claremont ran into issues with Editorial, because once something is this cash cow that they're trying to merchandise and license and all of that you're going to get, he always had, he and Jim Shooter fought over the Dark Phoenix saga. Like, there's always going to be stuff, but for about 16 years, he wrote the X-Men as though it was essentially a creator-owned IP, or like he was a mangaka or something like that, where he wasn't really, while he had to listen to Editorial, it really was his own vision that he had built out into this crazy, wide-ranging thing. Once there were disputes about that, and once Editorial came down on Lee's side of certain disputes and other considerations of Claremont, ended up leaving after only a few issues of the new run. So what happened after that was you suddenly had a whole mess of writers, some great, some whatever, writing a lot of different X books. And it had become such a juggernaut, no pun intended, of the industry that, again, it was sort of considered too big to fail. So you had a pivot where they were trying to sort of rebrand and Iron Age sort of 90s gridify every one of the different groups. So you had the Excalibur team over in England, which was my favorite book because I'm weird. You had X Factor got revamped into a new team with Havoc and Polaris that was like a government spy operation. You had the New Mutants get rebranded entirely into X-Force with the introduction of Cable and become like a paramilitary organization. And then they introduced... eventually they introduced Generation X as sort of the new class of students and brought Jubilee over to anchor that because she had become sort of the new Kitty Pryde, because Kitty was off in Excalibur and Jubilee had become very popular with kids because of the cartoon. So that 90s period, the cartoon really exemplifies a lot of that. You had Storm and Cyclops sort of doing double duty as leaders. For a long time, Uncanny was Storm's team and the mainline title was Scott's team, and they just sort of had two titles going on. And it was pretty much that core team from the cartoon, the Rogue and Gambit romance, with the addition of, for whatever reason, she wasn't in the cartoon very much, but Psylocke in her kind of politically not great form, having taken the body of the Japanese assassin Kanan, which has now been fixed finally after 30 years. And Kanan gets to be her own character, which is fantastic. But I digress. The basically those storylines like Executioner's Song and the one where they rip all of Wolverine's adamantium out. It's on Asteroid M. You know the one I'm talking about. Yeah. Fatal Attractions. And those storylines, and Phalanx Covenant, which is what introduced Gen X, and these were big yearly, as they had done since Mutant Massacre, events that spanned the whole franchise of titles. And this sort of culminated critically and in terms of audience response in the Age of Apocalypse storyline in 95, which was about, it started with a sort of more regular event where Legion, Professor Xavier's son, who had sort of profound mental illness and dissociative identities and a lot of, issues with that, went back in time and killed Xavier, which created this alternate dystopian timeline where Apocalypse, a character introduced by Louise Simonson in X Factor back in the 80s, who became a very popular mainstay villain of the franchise, sort of ruled with an iron fist, and humans were chattel and mutants ruled, and Magneto was the head of the X-Men to honor the memory of Xavier and yada yada. And for at least a year, I want to say, the whole line of titles was canceled and replaced by these alternate universe titles. And that was, I want to say it was unprecedented. I can't think of it's been done a lot since, because people try to replicate, both at Marvel and DC, people have tried to replicate that success. But I can't really think of, apart from like Crisis on Infinite Earths, like, and DC like rebooting things, but in terms that sticks, as opposed to like, oh, for this year, these titles are going to be completely different, and you're just going to roll with it. And people did. The thing about Age of Apocalypse was it was very 90s. It was very like extreme, grim, oppressive, like nihilism, but it was good. And for my father, who had been collecting X-Men from 1963 on, Age of Apocalypse for him felt sort of like the ending. That's sort of where he bowed out, because he was like, that was great. And then they came back from it and they could never quite hit it again. In 1996, Marvel declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy because the comic book industry was sort of disintegrating underneath them. And then sort of every attempt after that to recapture the pre-Age of Apocalypse heights of, the 1991 run just didn't quite come together. Like no one was really that excited about Operation Zero Tolerance. No one, like there were lots of storylines that just didn't quite find that audience in the same way. So by the late 90s, they started downsizing the X books because it had become this sort of sprawling apparatus. And without someone like Claremont and Simonson, really it was the two of them for most of the 80s, steering the whole thing with a unified vision, it started to become kind of bizarre, and the plot threads didn't quite hang together, and the events didn't quite hang together. The legacy virus storyline, which started in the early 90s, ran for way too long. Nobody liked it. Bastion and all his Sentinels were not that interesting. It just wasn't quite clicking. So in 1998, they canceled X Factor and canceled Excalibur. And they used that opportunity to bring Nightcrawler and Shadowcat and Colossus, who were in Excalibur, back to the X-Men because they thought that would be helpful. And they pivoted X Factor into a new book called Mutant X, where Havoc got shunted into an alternate dimension that was grim and gritty, which was sort of, I think, an attempt to recapture sort of that magic that they'd found with Age of Apocalypse. But I don't think Mutant X really ever found an audience in quite the same way. By the turn of the century, the turn of the millennium, the franchise was just not in a great place. And the idea was, okay, what do we do? Because we've lost the plot here, like quite literally. What's going on with the X-Men? I would have trouble telling you, and I am quite the X-Men head, which is why you invited me to talk to you today. I would have a lot of trouble telling you what exactly was going on in the X-Men in 1999. By the turn of the century, or the turn of the millennium, what they basically decided to do, because, why not try anything to stem the bleeding and sort of get the IP back to where it had been. The sort of solution that they came up with in Editorial was they hired Chris Claremont. They went and found Chris Claremont. They said, do you want the X-Men back? He said, obviously, yes. And so they did this big event called Revolution in 2000. And Revolution was most famous, or perhaps infamous among the fans, for this thing called the 6-month gap, which DC later kind of did a similar thing with 1 year later after Infinite Crisis. But whereas DC filled in the year gap from 1 year later with 52, Marvel never filled in the 6-month gap in the X books. It just was this weird, like, okay, we're jumping 6 months ahead because Chris Claremont doesn't want to deal with whatever we were just doing. And that's probably for the best, because a lot of what they had been doing was like, God, they did this whole long storyline to try and tie up the 12, which was this storyline with Apocalypse that had been introduced in the 80s, I want to say, and that had been going on for ages. And then the solution to, like, who are the 12 who are destined to defeat Apocalypse was like this mystery of the whole era. And then if you had been following it since the 80s, and like all of this stuff with like Tanya Trask and everybody traveling in time and trying to like make that happen, the ending that eventually resulted didn't make any sense. And the people who ended up being members of the 12 it just didn't work. Right. And that was sort of the last big, I think, attempt. And none of it really hung together. And so they brought Claremont back and they did this 6-month gap. And in the 6-month gap, weird stuff had happened that was never explained. So in the 6-month gap, all of this weird stuff happened that they never really bothered to explain. Like Psylocke and Jean Grey swapped powers. Nobody knows how that would have worked, but suddenly Psylocke had telekinesis and Jean didn't have telekinesis anymore. And like all of this weird stuff happened. It just like none of it. And they were like, oh, remember when we swapped powers, Jean? And it's like, what are you talking about? Like, and Psylocke was already confusing enough because of the 90s whole, like her whole arc with the Crimson Dawn and everything. Like her whole power set was already extremely confusing. Anyway, point is, I believe what happened was she had trapped the Shadow King in her brain so she could never use her telepathy again, was the idea. And then so she and Jean traded psychic energies so that she could become a telekinetic. I don't know. The point is, they brought Claremont back and they said, this is the revolution. This is going to be the whole big thing. And they branded it as sort of this cross, like one of the big events. And every X title at the time suddenly became like a revolution title, or I think Counter X was something else that they did. But nothing really like happened particularly, and the fans just didn't respond to it. It's interesting because I love the Claremont run from 75 to 91 enormous. Like I love that run. It's my favorite run in comics, probably. Certainly my second favorite probably being the Morrison run that came right after the period we're talking about. But for whatever reason, when he came back, it just didn't quite click. And I think it might be because he had been the architect of all those storylines and characters pretty much by himself for so long that once he had to return and take stock of who the characters were now, 10 years later almost, it just didn't quite click back into place. And I think that I think you look at a character like Rogue, and how much she had changed from sort of the tough butch, white trash gal of the 80s into sort of this like Southern Belle kind of in distress romantic character of the 90s, things like that. The characters had changed a lot. And I just, for whatever reason, it just didn't land. And it was a total flop. I mean, like the Revolution books, can anyone remember like the Neo? That was Revolution, wasn't it? Like who I could not possibly, in House of X and Powers of 10, when the mutant evolution chart was shown and Hickman threw in the Neo in there, I was like, that's very sweet, because we totally had forgotten about the Neo. So it was clear that this much vaunted rebrand wasn't working. And presumably, I mean, I don't know, but presumably they'd paid Claremont a good amount to come back. So they had to course correct. And what they ended up doing in 2001 was Joe Quesada brought in Grant Morrison from over at DC, where he'd been doing a lot of high profile titles there. And Morrison was basically given almost free rein to reboot the X-Men. The idea was to bring them more in line with the film, which was an enormous hit. And also just to try and recapture the magic that had made it the best-selling title in the business. And to keep Claremont happy, they gave him a new title, Extreme X-Men, and they let him take all his favorite characters for the most part over there. So, that was like, you can send Storm and Kitty and Psylocke and all of those people over to another title and you can play with them, but we're going to turn the flagship title now into, which is interesting because Uncanny was the flagship title, right? But after the 1991 shift, it really, the main X-Men title sort of became the flagship, because they gave Uncanny to Chuck Austin and nobody likes what he did with that. But
Joe Casey, I believe, for a while.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, you're right. But again, not a super memorable era. Morrison made a couple really interesting innovations. One was he did draw on the cinematic language of the films with sort of the black cat suits, which we talked about in our video about the X-Men movies, but where the black cat suits were indistinct and didn't really characterize anyone. Morrison and Quitely did a great job of creating a sort of a fashion collection almost. And every character, it was a cohesive look. They all wore black and yellow, except for Emma. And but each of them had a slightly different outfit. Like Jean didn't really wear the jacket very much. She mostly wore the turtleneck without the jacket. And Wolverine often wore the jacket without the turtleneck and with like a wife beater. And so like it made everyone look kind of kind of unified, but they had unique style. And then Emma was sort of the most obvious example where it's like, yes, she's like, I'll also wear like white. I'll also wear like tight latex with an X on it, but it's going to be white because that's my color. And I'm going to wear it backwards so that the X on the back is exposing my tits. Because that's just sort of how she rolls. And she was actually, I think, one of Morrison's biggest, I think everyone would agree, innovations, which is that actually came about because he wanted to use Storm and was told he couldn't because Claremont was taking Storm to extreme. And he wanted to use Colossus and he was told he couldn't because Colossus was dead. And at the time, Quesada had a policy that no dead characters were allowed to come back to life, which ended up really fucking over Chris Claremont because he killed off Psylocke to try and return her to her original body, and then Quesada made him keep her dead for quite a while. So that was a bummer for him. But anyway, I digress. The solution that Morrison found to not being able to use Storm or Colossus was to bring in Emma, which was a suggestion. A fan had asked him because Generation X was canceled around the same time. And a fan asked if there was any way he would do something with Emma Frost someday. And he was in development at the time. And he was like, that's interesting, because he was more familiar with her as a villain from the Claremont period. But she had been a hero since Phalanx Covenant when she sort of became one of the mentors for Generation X. And so he brought her over to be sort of the second woman, which, instead of it being Jean and Storm, it was Jean and Emma. But also he gave her the secondary mutation of the diamond form because he needed someone to have the Colossus power. So she basically pulled double duty there and ended up being his signature character in a lot of ways because the way he wrote her brought into stark relief a sort of triangle, a political triangular thing, whereas previously it's always been sort of, here's Magneto, he's a separatist, he believes that violence can be productive. Here's Xavier, he's, a pacifist allegedly, although every 5 years someone does a new Xavier is just as bad storyline. It's like, we get it, But Emma is more of like almost a radical libertarian. And she's like all about amassing sort of, it's like minority capitalism almost. But then she's also, the really iconic line for me early on is, when Jean is trying to convince her to stay and join the team. And she's like, I have been turned into, she's looking at her diamond fingers and she's like, I've been turned into a Fabergé killing machine for a reason. And I doubt it is to wave the flag for ex-liberalism. Because her politics are more radical. She had been on Genosha. She's one of the only survivors to witness the genocide of Genosha, which is the event that really kicks off Morrison's run. And she becomes kind of the militant voice that is different from Magneto, but still sort of pushing that angle because someone has to, because Magneto is believed to be dead after the fall of Genosha. So he basically brought a core group together. He picked out a very standard roster given the characters he was not allowed to use. So Cyclops, Phoenix, Wolverine, obvious. Then you have Beast to be the smart guy, and then Emma to be this wild card character. And he then pivoted to something more like the movies by having Xavier, under the influence of Cassandra Nova, expose the school to the general populace. So it did away with the frankly a little ridiculous status at the end of the 90s where it's like everyone at this point should know who these people are, right? So turning them into sort of public standard bearers for their cause, and opening up the school to create the sort of more vibrant school environment from the movies, as opposed to it being a school that has like 10 students at any given time. And it was a revelation. I mean, it changed everything. It was so different from what had come before that a lot of people, including myself at the time when it happened, were very resistant to it and skeptical, like longstanding, nerds. Because Claremont Claremont cares about nothing more than continuity. Morrison did not care very much about the continuity of anything previous to what he was doing. He notably kills off Unis the Untouchable at one point in the same way Unis the Untouchable had already died. People would pop up who had been dead or who should be in prison and he didn't care. In his pitch document, he wanted the death of Moira MacTaggert to be a really important plot element. And they had to tell him that Moira MacTaggert had already died in the end stages of the Legacy Virus storyline back in the 90s. So, he was playing fast and loose with it. And that's what he's always done. He had a reverence for the material from the 80s and the 70s, but he didn't feel beholden to the sort of cruft that had built up over the course of the 90s when it was this huge marketing juggernaut. And I think that's why it worked, because in retrospect, because he sort of unshackled himself from that downswing, from that period when there was so much going on and not much of it was anything anybody cared about. Mm-hmm. And what it really ended up doing was kind of recrystallizing the idea of the X-Men as this big ensemble story that radiates out into multiple books. And so the other X-Men books at the time, whether you liked Extreme and Austin's Uncanny or not, were sort of counterpoints and counterbalances to what was going on in the main title. And Morrison had incredible creative control over that title, to the point where as soon as he left, they retconned everything he ever did away, because they wanted to go back to the same old, and notably X-Men wasn't really very good again until last year. So, that's how the cookie crumbles. I think you have to let visionaries vision.
Yeah. By the way, do you remember anything about, wasn't there a year between Claremont and Morrison where I think Bob Dell came back? And I remember.
Yeah, is that when did Jean have that red costume?
That was Claremont.
Yeah. And Storm, right. Storm had the purple one with the sort of medieval looking beading.
Yeah, but I know there's a period, because I was just looking through my old single issues. There's a period, Colossus dying is, Claremont didn't write that issue.
Right. No, that's after. The end of the Legacy Virus is after he...
Yeah, and I know there's stuff with them fighting in Genosha where Magneto gets injured.
Magneto Dark Seduction, I believe, is what you're thinking of.
That was right before Morrison.
The miniseries, yeah, and that's where Polaris goes to Genosha and becomes Magneto's cabinet member, which is what sets her up for that incredible issue of New X-Men where she's the ghost in the ruins of Genosha. And suddenly his daughter, which again, that's just Morrison not caring, right? Which, here's the thing, it annoyed me at the time because I was no, the whole point, she's not his daughter. And now she's been his daughter for the last 20 years. And guess what? It works. So it's fine. Especially now that he doesn't have any other kids. Yeah. Because they fucked that up. So, yeah, I mean, I think that you're right. There is an even more dark period post-revolution, pre-E is for Extinction that I honestly don't remember any of. Yeah. I guess it's where Colossus dies and where... Is that Joseph?
No, I think he's earlier.
He's before. I'm truly trying to remember what the fuck happened in that, talk about a 6-month gap, right?
Right. If I remember correctly, just the vibe I got from that period is just after Claremont didn't really work, that's just a really half-hearted attempt to return to just a more classic
Yeah, I mean that's when they canceled Gen X and canceled X Force and canceled Mutant X, and we're just sort of like, okay, none of this is working anymore. And I think they were just kind of making time until they could figure out the big pivot, which was to bring Morrison over from DC. Yeah, I mean, it really is just kind of a classic tale almost of hubris, right? Because like the Claremont machine was so powerful that it honestly, and I'm not saying this to discredit the other writers in the 90s, although it's not my favorite period of the X-Men. Certainly there are many very successful stories in that period. But I think that it was the apparatus that Claremont and Simonson had created was strong enough and had enough, story built into it sort of from the get-go that even after they weren't in control of it, it managed to go to sort of inertia sort of drove it on with kind of, a little derivative. I mean, it was sort of it was a weird time, but it was a time that was still effective. And then once that juice was gone, there really was just nothing left in the tank. Like, I can't think of a single X-Men story after 1996 that and before 2001 that particularly excites me. I enjoyed the Lovedale and Ellis runs on Excalibur. Again, I was an Excalibur head, but even there was that whole weird period where like Captain Britain was lost in the time stream, and like then he came back as Britannic or whatever, and then he and Rachel Summers switched places, and then like all that sort of bizarre stuff. So there really wasn't a strong foothold anywhere, and I think the only thing they could have done was to really hard reboot in a sense. And it's funny, after Morrison was gone, they kind of tried to go back to the pre-Morrison model. So they brought in Whedon to do a very sort of Claremont-y thing with the characters. And then they just started setting up a franchise-wide event every year. Like you had, you had all kinds of weird events leading into House of M, which kind of killed the X-Men for a decade. Because after Morrison, they just didn't know what to do with it anymore, and they didn't own the movie rights, so they weren't that interested in pursuing it, as far as you can tell. So it really is it's a fascinating roller coaster, because it really for a good almost 10 years it was the number one comic book, and then it totally fell off. And I think that Morrison revitalized it, certainly critically. I don't know enough about the sales figures there to say much there, but certainly it was very critically acclaimed. I think Morrison's run is the greatest after that original Claremont run in terms of the X-Men. But then after Morrison innovated so much, they tried to go back to the formula. They had Claremont stick around and do Uncanny for a while. I mean, it just didn't. It never really worked again. And I fell off. Like, I was a lifelong X-Men person, and House of M, I was like, I'm out. Like, not the story itself, which was fine, but the decimation to me defeated the whole purpose of the book. I mean, if your minority is 198 people, then that's not a minority. That's like a lecture hall. It doesn't. I mean, it just doesn't. The metaphor doesn't work anymore. And to me, the metaphor is the strength of X-Men. That's why the '60s X-Men never really worked, and the '70s X-Men did. Because the '60s X-Men, where it was just this tiny group, it's not it's not as effective. They're not as effective when they're just superheroes. That's not what the X-Men's about. The X-Men has to be about sort of the civil rights metaphor and about the community of misfits, because otherwise it doesn't have anything special. It's just like sort of an off-brand Avengers, right? And that's why I think Hickman's new Dawn of X era is so brilliant, because it has sort of it's brought back that E is for Extinction vibe of like mutants are overtaking humans. It's brought everybody back. And it's playing with a lot of very sort of spicy and interesting ideas about self-determination and nationalism and Zionism and all kinds of things that I think are really fascinating to that Genosha also explored, but not for very long because the book tanked and then Morrison blew it up. Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested to see where it goes. I'm really enjoying it. I'm particularly enjoying Excalibur, written by Teenie Howard, whom I represent as literary agent. You should read that book; it's great. If you're an old Excalibur head like me, it's extremely satisfying. Like when she brought back Opal Luna Saturnine, I almost died.
So, Connor, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here. And anybody who'd like to chat with me, I'm always around. You can go to connorgoldsmith.com, and all my socials are linked there.